I'm integrative, holistic, spiritual physician, and it's so much more joyful doing things the way I do it now. I spend an hour with my new patients.
After many years of working as a mainstream medical doctor, Dr. Roach hit a wall. Over the next 20 years, he completely revolutionized his approach to medicine and his personal life.
It was around 2011 when I had my first patient with a spiritual near-death experience. And she went out of body and she felt the bliss, the love. And she said she got mad about coming back. And here I've studied 23 years, have 20 years of clinical experience. And you don't care whether you live, just learn how to save lives, and you don't care whether you live or die. And I thought, but actually that would be kind of nice if I didn't have to worry about that. And I thought, well, what if I could teach my patients that?
And now for my conversation with Dr. Jim Roach. Hi, please note that while we have an absolutely fascinating conversation with Dr. Jim Roach, we are not a medical podcast. We are not making any medical claims or recommendations in this episode. Consult your doctors with any medical concerns. We are not making any medical recommendations in this episode. Hi, everyone. So, major exciting news. Book number 1, WTF Just Happened. A Sciencey Skeptic Investigates Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife, is now available in audiobook. You can get it through my website or on Apple Books and on Audible. I read it myself, which was a really intense learning experience as well as emotional, as I relived a lot of memories. But for those of you who want to hear even more of my voice for some reason, or also are like me and prefer audiobooks, you can now listen to it. And what's also fun is some of the people read themselves. So you can go to my website, wtfjusthappened.net, where I link to Audible and Apple Books, or you can go directly to Amazon to get it on Audible or Apple Books to get it there. And I hope you enjoy it. And as always, let me know any feedback. Today I'm talking to Jim Roach, MD, America's Healer, and I met him at the IONS conference. So welcome, Dr. Roach. It's really a pleasure to have you on. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I really appreciate you inviting me. I'm integrative, holistic, spiritual physician in central Kentucky, near Lexington, Kentucky, a small town. I'm 71 years of age. I've been practicing for 42 years, so a lot of experience. I think for 20 years, the last 20 years, probably have had the best outcomes of any practice in Kentucky. It's such a reversal from my first 20 years doing conventional medicine, and knowing what I do now, I cannot ethically go back to doing that. And it's so much more joyful doing things the way I do it now. I spend an hour with my new patients, and maybe 35 minutes or so on follow-up visits. So really get to know them well.
So what is I know you refer to yourself as a holistic spiritual physician. What is that exactly?
Well, first of all, I assess patients very comprehensively. And as I indicated, I spend a lot of time with patients, really getting to know them. I address their spiritual understanding, I educate them about quantum physics, about spiritual near-death experiences, transformative spiritual events that my patients have had. These days, I even talk to them about UFOs and ETs because I have some fascinating experience that direction. And of course, I recommend just natural, healthy interventions. I love particularly to recommend botanicals. I'm probably the top botanical medicine physician this side of the Mississippi River, I would guess.
Well, so
I'm going to have to ask you all about NDEs, UFOs, but I just want to ask you one more question first.
Yeah.
How did you get into holistic spiritual medicine?
Around the year 2000, I was approaching 50 years of age, and I wanted to see how long and how well I could live. I started reading every journal that I could. I started attending conferences like Andrew Weil's Nutrition and Health Conference, and then later American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine conferences, A4M conferences. Then I discovered Donnie Yance, and he's been a mentor for the last 17 years. He's the top botanical medicine expert in the country. I've attended a lot of IFM lectures. So, 50 of those in all. And I've had my own conferences as well over the last 10 or 11 years. So I'm really into education, both receiving it and also educating practitioners. And we've had practitioners from London to Canada and so forth at our conference we have here in Kentucky.
Okay, so what I really want to get into, since this is a podcast about afterlife evidence, tell me, I know you know quite a bit about NDEs. When did you first hear of them?
It was around 2011 when I had my first patient with a spiritual near-death experience. And she went out of body and she felt the bliss, the love. And she said she got mad about coming back. And subsequently, she's been very mission-oriented and focused. And that really kind of puzzled me. And I thought, here I've studied 23 years, have 20 years of clinical experience. And you don't care whether you live, just learn how to save lives, and you don't care whether you live or die. And I thought, but actually that would be kind of nice if I didn't have to worry about that. And I thought, well, what if I could teach my patients that? I said that to myself, but I said it in a preposterous way, that would never happen. But now it's exactly what is happening with that.
So, oh, sorry, you were going to say something else?
Well, I'll be happy to share some of those experiences if you'd like.
Yes.
Probably one of the early, more impressive ones was Colioso. He was an 18-year-old Afro-American who wanted to avoid Vietnam, so he volunteered and went to Okinawa. He was driving a Jeep rather recklessly. He would have gone over a cliff 70 feet and died, but he hit a building next to the cliff and immediately went into a spiritual near-death experience, out of body, felt in the bliss of the divine. And after surviving that, the next 10 years he traveled throughout the world, investigating every religion, trying to understand as much as he could. He communicated telepathically with yogis, for example. But then he started to question his first experience. He said, "Prove to me, God, the reality of you. Now be careful of what you ask for." So a car crossed 4 lanes of traffic and T-boned him and nearly ripped his nose off. He had so many fractures in his face, it took several pages on the radiology report to describe all that. And he said he felt like he was naked in a chair in the middle of New York City. Couldn't get under it, couldn't get around it. And then he felt like he was going down a river in the dark. He could see some individuals on the bank who he intuited were his ancestors. And then it gradually got light. He felt in the presence of the Almighty, and then he full light, and he came out of that, but fully transformed. He didn't question anymore after that. Colioso also, incidentally, had 2 UFO experiences. Now, I have a chapter on him in my book, God's House Calls, but he said,
Okay.
don't
I just want to ask one question, and then I'm going to ask you about the UFOs. He uses traditionally religious language, such as God, Almighty. Was he raised? I know some NDEers use traditionally religious language and others do not. I'm just curious, was he raised in a religion? Is that why those words were the ones he used?
Yeah, I think he was raised in a religion. Now, by the time I met him, though, he actually had become a shaman. And that's a whole nother story because, he read the tarot cards for me once, which was helpful. But then he invited me into his house, into a special place and consulted the oracles. And the oracles named me Imhotep. And obviously that got my curiosity up. His wife was there with him, and her eyebrows raised. She was very fascinated by that. Imhotep, the first physician, 3000 BC. And as a follow-up to that, I will share that just 3 months ago, I visited a trance channel who reads your higher self. And this is getting a little deep and for some of the listeners, I realize. But for an hour, my higher self spoke to me, answered questions, and said, I have a fork in the road coming up. And I thought, well, that's nuts. I'm 71 years old. I'm near the end of my career. I'm through with forks in the road. But my higher self said, you can retire into your humanness, or you can continue as a healer, or every other past lifetime, you've been a shaman, oracle, and healer. And that caught my attention with that. So maybe it wasn't an accident that I met up with Colioso, a shaman. And so now, just in that 3 months, I'm incorporating a lot of spirituality in terms of what I do at the office. So apologize for getting in a little deep early with that.
Oh, it's
Maybe that intrigues.
interesting.
Yeah. Another interesting story that one of my patients shared. This was an older woman. When she was young growing up, she was neglected by her mother. And there was a woman in the neighborhood who took her under her wing and served as her mentor. Several decades later, the young woman, Anne, woke up in the middle of the night after a vivid dream where this older woman was riding through her front yard on a choo-choo train, leaning out, waving toot, 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 toot. And it woke her up and looked at the clock, and it was 1:20 in the morning. When she came downstairs, of course, she learned that the woman had died. She said, well, what time? Well, that was 2:20 in the morning, but it was a different time zone. Anne was compelled to go to the visitation and tell the greeter that story. And the greeter held up 4 fingers and said, you're the 4th person with the identical story. Okay. So
Wait,
that
said to her with the seeing someone on seeing this woman on a train who passed.
So 3 other individuals who'd come to the visitation reported seeing this older woman on a train going through a yard, leaning out, waving toot, 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 toot. So Anne wasn't the only one. And that was a rather convincing story from a very humble woman who had some Native American heritage, which maybe made her a little bit more intuitive than the rest. One more interesting story, if you'd like.
Yeah, may I ask I want to ask one confirmation question quickly. And then after these 4 people saw this woman on a train, they found out the woman had passed that week. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah, they found right after that because they had that same dream. So clearly she, right after she passed, she was visiting these individuals. I guess that's what you call a kind of shared death experiences, might be a terminology associated with that. But 4 separate people, far apart, time zones apart, experiencing the same thing simultaneously.
And then now you were about to tell another story. I just wanted to verify. So now tell the next.
Yeah. So I was in Philadelphia for a speaking engagement, and the cab driver shared a story of a woman who had moved out of her house into a new house when she got divorced. And every time she came into this house, there was a tall apparition dressed in ancient kind of military garb. And she didn't know what the significance of that, but it didn't cause any harm to her. And after a while, she figured out that every time she came in the front door in the evening, he was coming in from the cemetery through the back door with that. He would stand in her doorway at night, or in her bedroom doorway at night when she was sleeping. One night, she felt a tug at her sleeve, and it was this apparition tugging at her sleeve. And she got up and looked out of the window, and her ex-husband had just parked his car out in front of her house. So this Evidently, Civil War era apparition was guarding this woman. That was his duty, and she felt relieved and comforted by that fact, and was so happy to have him around through the subsequent years.
And how had she identified this apparition as someone from the Civil War? What made her think
I think it
that?
was I think the graves out back were dated around that time, and the type of garb he had was consistent with Civil War uniforms.
Okay. And you mentioned that the first gentleman you met had UFO experiences. What were those?
Well, he had traveled up to Ohio from Kentucky, where we live, and he was in the evening. Evidently, a UFO appeared, and he stepped out of his car, and then the next several hours disappeared. And he woke up in the morning, but he definitely remembered being on the UFO. And then it happened a second time. So he didn't share a lot of details about that. But I have had a Catholic priest at my office who shared that he was on a UFO vehicle and there's a translation device, and it was used so he could communicate with the extraterrestrials. I've had over 25 patients and other individuals share compelling stories about UFOs. For example, a Berea College professor, when he was growing up on Long Island at 12 years of age, there was a 300-foot UFO at treetop level. He could have thrown a rock and hidden it. And it reappeared 2 days later to where his wife saw it as well. There's a retired lawyer in Lexington who's seen UFOs on 2 different occasions, and one, again, just at treetop level associated with that. There's an older 89-year-old Afro-American woman who's a patient of mine, and she saw my chapter on UFOs in my book, Brilliance, and said, well, my husband and I were at the edge of Midway. There was electricity in the air one evening, and we looked up and saw 2 UFOs. Another individual described being drawn out in the middle of the night in her gated community for no apparent reason 2 nights in a row, and then on the third night, again drawn out at midnight, and she stayed out to 4 a.m. and then saw a UFO. But she didn't have her phone to take a picture, was mad about that. And then a fourth night, she was drawn outside. But this time she had her phone, took a picture, and she said, I'm not sharing this information with anyone, but I feel like I'm supposed to share it with you. And it was like a toothpick sideways with lights around the perimeter. But to get into deeper with that, if you wish.
Yes, please.
Okay. So in 1949, at Mayfield, Kentucky, there were 30 sightings of UFOs, and Fort Knox was contacted. They sent up 3 pilots, one of them a 25-year-old, who identified a large metallic UFO at about 20,000 feet, followed it up that high. He lost oxygen and crashed. He had a 19-year-old understudy who, for the next 25 years, traveled across the country whenever there were reports of UFOs. But then he learned how to contact the ETs. His girlfriend could go into a trance, and while in a trance, she could verbalize messages, communications from the ETs. Now, some people may wonder, how is that possible? Remember, Einstein described spooky behavior at a distance. You take a particle, split it in half, it goes to opposite ends of the universe. Any action on one half particle instantaneously acts on the other half particle, the other end of the universe. So yes, communication across the universe instantaneously is indeed possible. So that was 50 years ago, and they have transcribed messages from these extraterrestrials over that 50-year span. And I've read, over 1,000 pages of those communications. Fascinating. And even to this day, those communications are continuing. So I attend a small group of about 15 where we have 1, 2, or 3 channelers, and we get messages and then we can ask questions and get answers in real time. Now, you may think, well, how do you know that's real? Well, imagine living in a black and white world where everything is black and white. You look at a TV, it's black and white, and then you see a red rose. Now, how do you describe that? What equation can tell someone else what a red rose looks like when they've never seen that color? Well, when you experience real-time channeling with ET, yeah, you know 100.00% that it's the real thing. Nobody's going to be able to talk you out of it. And this isn't a money-making phenomena. These are just middle-class people that are they're not fanatic in any way, shape, or form. And it's a very meaningful experience to participate in that.
Now, I'm going to ask you a little more about UFOs. I'm going to ask you about channeling. Of all the UFO stories you've heard, and it sounds like you've heard a lot, I'm going to ask you, first of all, what would you say is the most remarkable out there? And then after that, I'm going to ask you what you think is the most evidential one.
So I think to me, the messages that I'm getting in relation to the UFOs, so clearly, they're appearing only when they want to appear. Okay, they travel between dimensions, and they only appear like the woman I indicated. They gave her warning 2 nights in advance before she came out. She didn't know why she was going outside in the gated community at the middle of the night, but they were drawing her on purpose out there. They felt that she was an appropriate person for them to connect in with. And what I've learned is that these are benign, for the most part, entities. In fact, they're of service to the Creator, and they report that there's one loving, powerful Creator that we are all a part of. Call that the Law of One, if you wish. And the first time I heard of the Law of One was with Edgar Cayce. Now, some of your listeners would know Edgar Cayce, but many of them probably don't. He was the father of holistic medicine. He was the sleeping prophet. At age 7, he was reading the Bible through and through and through, just multiple times. And he kept asking God, how can I be of service? How can I be of service? An angel then appeared in his room in the middle of the night and said, your prayers are heard and are going to be answered. And he was given a special gift. He had a lot of paranormal experiences up to the point of age 20 when he learned that he could go into a trance and then espouse cures for disorders. All he needed was a name and address. And he was just a farm boy from southern Kentucky. But yet, when his wife had terminal tuberculosis, the doctor said, you better go into a trance and come up with a cure or else she'll be dead within a week. And he went into trance and gave a beautiful lecture on tuberculosis. Now, this doctor just finished traveling internationally to speak on tuberculosis, and he said that was the most beautiful lecture on TB that he had ever heard. And he gave the cure for her situation, and she indeed got well, fully recovered from that. He gave over 14,000 readings, and he also described reincarnation. But that's the first time the Law of One was shared, and that's what these ETs are saying as well, the same message. So they're in a higher, we'll call it a 6th density. We're in 3rd density. You might say 4th density is the less physical density of love, 5th density wisdom, and 6th density kind of love and wisdom. But they're being of service. Now, they can't interfere with our free will, but they can give us guidance, for example, on how to meditate. I asked the question, would it be accurate to say that we are loved, for me to tell my patients, that they are loved more than they could ever imagine? And in fact, that was the case. In fact, I used the analogy of an individual being on a jumbo screen, right, at a football stadium, but stadium bigger than any you can imagine, full of angels. And they're watching for any kind deed that you do. And the moment you do a kind deed, they're all jumping to their feet and cheering, right? I said, is that an apt analogy? And they said, yes, that very definitely is. So it's fascinating to communicate. And, it's a paradigm shift. Once absolutely for certain about the ETs, about the universe. Now, there is some negative energy. There's the service to self and the service to others, that duality on Earth, and there's some of that duality in the universe as well, though ultimately that merges into the service to others category.
And now, is there a consistency amongst all the UFO stories you've heard?
Yes, to me, there is. Now, the greatest expert in that area is Stephen Greer, MD. He was an emergency room physician, but he was a consultant to the U.S. presidents for 20 years on UFOs. And so he's amassed a vast amount of information. He says there have been 121 UFO crashes on Earth. And he noted the story, and this has been verified, that 10 different American ICBM nuclear missiles were deactivated all at the same time, even though they were not in any way connected, as a message from the ETs: don't explode those nuclear missiles. And in fact, they're kind of watching from above to try to protect us against nuclear accidents. They don't want a nuclear holocaust, which reverberates out through the universe to some extent.
And now, do you think most of these UFOs, it sounds like you think they're more interdimensional rather than just, we have UFOs out in other planets millions of light years away, that because, we see the photos we're seeing way back in time. For all we know, the planets we're seeing the photos of have intelligent life on them now, but because of the way light travels, we can't know that the photos we're seeing. So those are UFOs if there are intelligent material life forms on those planets. Do you think they're in our dimension in other solar systems, or is it interdimensional?
Right. So, first of all, kind of to expand on what you're saying, the universe is 14 billion years old. The Milky Way is 12 billion years old. There are 400 billion stars in the Milky Way and 100 to 400 billion habitable planets in the Milky Way. And there are 2 trillion galaxies like the Milky Way out there, right? And probably more. That's all we can see with our new telescope at this point. But once we get an even better one, we'll likely find many, many more beyond that. So statistically, we know it's almost, essentially impossible that there's not life out there. Now think about this. The Earth is just 4 billion years old, and so is the sun. And that means, we're one of the youngest stars in the Milky Way. So these other entities within the Milky Way have had maybe a 1 to 5 billion year head start. So we're like the little kid, and Big Brother is out there kind of watching out for us. And actually, it's my understanding that there's a federation within the Milky Way, and they're watching out for it to try to protect it from the predator service to self ET entities that are out there. So, we're largely being protected. Earth is somewhat unique, in the universe, maybe completely unique with regards to that. But yeah, I think the number of ETs, we can't imagine how many different kinds of ETs are out there, right? With that many galaxies and, how many universes are there out there beyond that? But to travel the way they do, they have to go kind of interdimensionally, to go through portals to reach us. But Stephen Greer, has been able to call UFOs. His I believe it's CS5. I think that's what that's called, and you can look that up. They have groups of 15 where they call the UFOs to appear, and they appear with that. So that's a practice that's going on, every month right here in America. So, you could find out for yourself that way as well.
And for all we know, advanced species are able to teleport. We, I believe, have teleported definitely a quantum particle. I don't remember the specificities of it, but we did, I know, in laboratories, and we've teleported quantum particles. So when you look at how much we've advanced scientifically in 1,000 years, if they're 10,000 years more advanced than us,
Well,
maybe
I'm
they're able to
suggesting we're
teleport.
imagine humans are from here, where would we be in 1 to 5 billion years as far as technology? I think in that time frame, yeah, you can uh, come up with some pretty incredible things and mirroring what you're saying.
Yeah, I hope we make it that long. We're risking destroying our planet. Hopefully, we
Well,
turn it around some.
we're in right now is a very unique time because we're in this planet, and we as humans are evolving. Our awareness is rising very rapidly. Over the past 15, 20 years, it's been rising, but now it's rising much faster. So despite all the wars around the world, our consciousness, our awareness that our consciousness survives forever is increasing dramatically. And so we're rapidly evolving into fourth density and fifth density type entities. And I'm not sure, I don't want to get in beyond, I'll just leave it at that. There may be some more information beyond that.
It's interesting to think about. Now, where do you get all this information? Just talking to different people, or?
Well, it's been an evolution. Again, 2011 was when I heard that first spiritual near death experience, right? And your curiosity gets raised. And now I've had, 800 to 900 with transformative spiritual events. So, you don't need to hear very many spiritual near death experiences to get it. After the fifth or the 10th one, you get it, right? Because they all are so similar in terms of what they report, in terms of, feeling blissful, not wanting to come back, that it's more real than it is here on earth. So you gain a certain knowledge and reality from those stories if you're listening to those. And then also, I'll just mention as a sidelight that, an individual won the Nobel Prize last year on quantum entanglement. Now, most mothers, if their child's getting in trouble, it doesn't matter whether it's the next block or the other side of the world, they know it right here instantly. If you talk to most any mother, they will admit to that if they're open and frank with that. So that's quantum entanglement, and that means ultimately that we all are connected with one another, and maybe even out across the universe. We're all connected to and all a part of one creator, and so we're kind of climbing the ladder, kind of regaining our knowledge of the creator. And learning how to have unconditional love and 100% gratitude all of the time. And as we eventually climb that ladder, we'll reach a level where we can reemerge fully with the Creator. So the ETs, acknowledge that, and that's consistent again with Edgar Cayce and all of his reports.
And what do you think, or what information have you gotten what is this creator? Is it like a non-local consciousness that we're all a hologram part of? I've heard things like that. I mean, I've heard different theories. So what do you think this creator is?
I think the simple way to think about it is that, in essence, it's waves, energy waves. And then at one point, those energy waves recognized itself. And it's my belief that once it identified itself, then it may have felt lonely, right? We like companionship. If you're a big entity out there, you'd want companionship too, I would assume. So humans were created, in my opinion, and from what I've learned, for the purpose of learning about the Creator and then learning to love and appreciate the Creator. So that way, God has friends. God wants to pal around, with us, and God has a sense of humor with this. And God creates through intention. So remember, with quantum physics, we essentially are just waves. Now, technically, every nanosecond we go in and out every 20,000 times every nanosecond. So, but essentially, think of ourselves as waves. Now, when someone looks at us, we particulate a little bit more, 0.00001% particles. Imagine an atom the size, well, with a nucleus the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, the electrons the size of garden peas, and the amount of space the size of 2 qubits. So again, we're 99.9999% hot air. So waves penetrate very readily. Normally, even when we particulate, imagine those waves kind of crystallizing temporarily. The double slit experiment was the classic experiment that's been replicated over and over and over again. And basically, that's where you take a barrier and put 2 slits and have a photosensitive wall behind that, right? You shine a beam of light. And if someone is observing that, then that light will go through one of those 2 slits and make a mark on the photosensitive wall. But if no one is watching, what happens? That whole wall lights up. And why is that? Because it is waves traveling through those slits at that point that then are able to light up the whole wall. So when that research was done, that was obviously transformative. There's other fascinating research like the random number generator experiments where a computer spits out ones and zeros. And then if you have a group of people meditating on the number 1, then the computer, which is randomly generating these, will spit out more ones than zeros. And even more fascinating, if the computer spits out numbers, you put that in a sealed envelope. 6 months later, you have a group meditating, say, once again, they're meditating on the number 1. You open the envelope, and the computer had produced more ones than zeros. That's quantum physics, and that's been duplicated. I love the research by Masaru Emoto, right? You're familiar with that? I think it was New York
A
Times
little bit. Yeah,
Yeah,
tell
right.
me a little. Tell us all.
Yeah.
I'm very familiar with the
Well,
random number generators and the Global Consciousness Project of Dr. Roger Nelson that everyone should look up. But yeah, tell
yeah.
me. I'm not as familiar
So
with.
Masaru Emoto took 2 containers of water and he sent loving messages, verbalized loving messages to one container of water, and then hateful messages to the other container of water. Then he froze the water, sliced it, looked under the microscopes, and he saw, when he had sent loving messages, beautiful crystals. But where he'd sent hateful messages, it was chaotic. He then just simply wrote loving messages on a piece of paper and taped it to the container, and then hateful messages and taped it to the other container, and the results were identical. Crystals, beautiful crystals, where the positive message was, and we're 70% water. Okay, now this is very powerful because every thought is an action, right? Every thought we're sending out waves. And waves penetrate. You see how much space we are. The waves penetrate everywhere, right? They go through the liver, the kidneys, they go through tumor cells, and they penetrate anything. Now, if you're sending out positive waves, that's very healing. But if you're sending out negative waves, that's very detrimental to your health. Joseph Chilton Pierce, who spoke at a conference I put on 12 years ago, wrote a book called Cracking the Cosmic Egg. His wife had end-stage breast cancer. They sent her home to die. She did a 10-day fast followed by an 11-day fast, and he read continuous positive energy literature while she was awake and while she was asleep. And the end of those 21 days, she was well. So the idea of sending continuous positive energy to your body and blocking off the negative energy, because news coming in, right, maybe negative energy, usually is. So that's what I'm preaching to my cancer patients now, to focus on unconditional love, unconditional gratitude 24/7. And I'm anxious to see how much an impact that's going to have with their healing.
Hey everyone! I'm really excited to let you know about the science and spirituality salons I'm now hosting. During these intimate events, a scientifically verified psychic medium will give all of you readings, and I will give a talk on the science and evidence that changed my mind about an afterlife. This will also be an amazing opportunity to get to meet some of you in person or virtually, and to share more about all the science and data that transformed my worldview and got me through my worst days. These can be hosted in your home, in a nearby cafe with a private room, or they can even be virtual. I've hosted a few already, and they were really special, fascinating, emotional, evidential. So if you're interested in getting a small group together over dinner, brunch, drinks, coffee, to learn more about the science and to get evidential medium readings, send me an email at hello@wtfjusthappened.net and put science and spirituality in
I
the
was about to ask you if you've gotten the data on the impact of that. I mean, no matter what, if you're dealing with something as challenging as cancer, if nothing else, this is going to make your journey, whatever the outcome, I would think,
Right. Sure. Yeah.
less traumatic.
The cancer patients, I tell them about the spiritual near-death experiences, and I explain, if everything goes wrong, if all my recommendations are wrong, if everything you do is wrong, the downside is ultimate bliss, right? That's what the near-death patients share. So you're going to be fine. Now, your family wants to keep you around, so I'm working for them, but you're going to be in great shape and because it's vital for cancer patients. That's the biggest part of my practice, 30% of my practice. Is the most important thing is to get them in a peaceful state. When you implant breast tumors in mice and stress one group of the mice, the stressed group has a 30-fold increase in metastases. If you give a drug, propranolol, that blocks adrenaline, that prevents most of the metastases. So the most important thing with new cancer patients is to get them into a peaceful state. And that's what that information accomplishes.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to be diagnosed with anything, I mean, we're all terminal. The second you're born, we're going in one direction. So if we can get this hope out there about NDEs, and we're all going to lose someone we love very much, unless we ourselves die very, very young. And that's just, this information can really be transformative.
Yeah, we just need to change perspectives. We're just not getting to graduate yet, right? As the way I look at it. So if we try to graduate too soon, right, the near-death patients tell us they're sent right back down. They're not allowed to die early.
Right. What would you say is the most evidential or veridical NDE story you've heard?
Well, from an evidential perspective, rather than give you a story, I think just going through the evidence. First of all, there are millions of spiritual near-death studies. You get on YouTube, you can find just study, and they all mirror each other. They all have the same experience, and individuals coming back from that are changed individuals. They become more spiritual. They're more focused on helping the world become better. They become less religious, less dogmatic, and more spiritual. They're recognizing that it's all about love, right? That's what they're learning with that. So 80% of children that have had cardiac arrests experience spiritual near-death experiences. 80% that have that. The University of Virginia School of Medicine Division of Perceptual Studies has had over 2,500 children that reported to them that they were reincarnated from other individuals. And with 170 of those, very strong evidence, and some of those stories are essentially bulletproof. So basically, the evidence is that reincarnation is real, but we have so much other evidence about that from Edgar Cayce and otherwise that reincarnation is absolutely the case. And the extraterrestrials, when I communicate with them, they readily acknowledge, reincarnation on Earth. So in my mind, that's no longer a question mark. And then I've also had experiences where I've been out of body, connecting with the divine, and have gotten messages. For example, my Colioso that I mentioned earlier, he died a couple of years ago. And in my out-of-body experience, he came through and said, Dr. Imhotep, he called me Imhotep, Dr. Imhotep, appreciate the love and grace you provide to your patients. And I've gotten other messages, even health messages through that, evidence that my higher self was speaking to me because it told me about a traumatic story. When I was 8 years old, I got spanked. I remembered the experience, but it said, hit my knee, terrible grace, terrible haste. So I didn't remember being hit in the knee. It was giving more details. And then it was editorializing with, terrible grace, terrible haste with that. So, um,
It was
uh,
a memory you'd repressed that came out. You said you were
well,
like something
yeah.
happened to your knee. I mean, you don't have to go into the
Well,
story if you don't.
so yeah, we took the Santa Fe train across the country. We were Yosemite National Park, and we were on a trail. And I ran ahead on the trail at 8 years of age, and then I tried to run back to reconnect, and no one was there, and I couldn't find them. There was a lawn that said "Do not trespass," but finally I said I'm going to go because I knew my motel was in the distance there. So I thought my parents would be so relieved when I showed up. My dad was not relieved because his in-laws were there, and he was probably embarrassed. So he spanked me. I thought at 8 I was a little old to be spanked, and
I mean, no one should be hit. Ideally, I can't stand
yeah,
by physical violence, especially against
right,
someone smaller. So I'm but older generations didn't.
yeah.
I guess that was how it was done. But I'm sorry you went through that.
Well, it was a life lesson. So everything's a lesson. And that's the most important thing, really, is to realize that every challenge we have is something we're supposed to have and learn how to overcome. And as you probably realize at this point, before we come into this incarnate state, we decide, which challenges we want to take on. So, cancer, other major challenges, we've decided that before we come into this incarnation, what those challenges are going to be. So it's just a matter of how do we respond to that challenge? Do we respond by pulling our hair out and running with our arms in the air, or do we respond in a mature way and realize that, with that diagnosis of cancer, that you're now living in the present. You're not living in the future or living in the past. You're living in the now. And so you learn to appreciate the now. Every moment you learn to appreciate every gesture of kindness, and that changes your life. I have a patient who came to me in 2017 with stage 4 HER2 breast cancer, and now she's had 12 chemotherapies. And she said, "This isn't a path I would have chosen, but I'm glad that this happened because I've learned so much by this process," right? You hear these stories. An individual who had pancreatitis was in the hospital for a year and a half. And he said, I wouldn't change a thing. I'm glad that I had that experience because I learned from that. And that's the whole idea, that these are lessons that we learn from and then go on to the next lesson. And, if we don't get these lessons, life gets very boring, right? We don't appreciate joy unless we've experienced hurt and challenge.
Right. Yeah, that is true. And life is just hard, and people make mistakes. People have their own traumas they enact on others. It's just really tough.
But we need to
And
learn to forgive, first of all, ourselves and forgive others, and not a level of, I forgive you, but you're still a jerk, but a level of grace so that we can live in the present and not be called in the back, in the past with these experiences, so we can let go of that negativity that festers within us.
yeah. And now you said yourself you've had some precognitive dreams. I would love to hear about those.
Yeah, I just started doing dream work back in June. So I tried to write down my dreams first thing every morning. And it was about July 4th where I was looking down at a factory floor from about a 45-degree angle, and it looked like nearly 1,000 people in yellow jumpsuits, one-piece jumpsuits. And it was such a bizarre dream that I told my wife about it. I even told my daughter about it. It really was vivid and made an impression. 1 week after that, a picture was taken at the Tesla Gigafactory in Austin, Texas, of a factory floor. And that picture, that was the day the first Cybertruck was produced. So that picture was taken 1 week after my dream, signifying the first Cybertruck. And then I'm a shareholder of Tesla stock. I was looking online at their second quarter report, and there was that identical picture, looking at a 45-degree angle down to factory floor and nearly 1,000 workers in yellow vests. And in the center of that was a Cybertruck. And why that's significant to me is that my whole retirement is tied up with Tesla stock, and that Cybertruck is the most important player with that, right? So not only, it wasn't just a random precognitive dream, it was a dream to directly related in a very personal way and a very financial way to me.
And have you had other paranormal experiences yourself? I know you mentioned out of body experiences, but I believe you said you had some other precognitive dreams as well.
Well, one story I'd particularly want to mention is that I had a patient who came to see me, and then 1 month later, she came back to the front desk of the office and said, "I've got to see Dr. Roach." And my wife said, "Well, he's booked out 3 months." But she said, "No, I've got to see him today." It turns out, she lived in Colorado with her husband, and she had a vision. Now, she's had 3 near-death experiences, and the more of those you have, the more intuitive you are. So she had the appearance of a college on a hill and the word Ashland. So it was a riddle. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew she had to solve that riddle. She went to Ashland, Oregon to try to get answers and couldn't get any. And then she and her husband moved to Central Kentucky, and she came to see me as a patient. So I walked, on this second visit, I walked in the room and she said, "You're probably going to think I'm crazy, but," and she took my index finger, middle finger, fourth finger back to the index and said, and as I need to say that I was planning to have my first conference, but I just decided a month earlier it was going to be a small conference, and only 2 to 3 people had signed up, and I was planning to have it in just a few weeks from there. I had not told anybody, not even my wife, I don't think, where I was going to have the conference. But this patient said that conference that you're going to have at Midway College next month is supposed to happen. And she said it's a very powerful message because it caused me to go to Ashland, Oregon, and then it caused my husband and I to move to Central Kentucky to then come to see you to give you that message about the conference. And then I mentioned, well, I'm thinking about writing a book. She said, "Oh, that's written in stone that you'll write a book." And of course, I've written 3 books at this point. So that was a very powerful message for me personally. My wife and I have walked a lot under street lights at night, and 85% of the time they turn off, and 15% of the time they turn on. You would think 50-50, right? But I figured out that when they turn off, and it's kind of God's personality, the Creator's personality, that's kind of affirmation that I've done well that day. And when they turn on, ironically, it means I need to reassess how I've managed my day with patients. So that's another experience.
Interesting. So it's kind of a communication with you, because I know
Yeah.
near-death experiencers
Yeah.
tend to affect electronics, but
Yeah.
you have the same, but you feel it's a type of communication with
Yeah.
what you call
Yes.
God. So,
Yeah.
mhm.
Right. I also had a dream a few years ago. I was in my church my church pew by myself, and a bubble came down from the ceiling, and it got larger and larger, and then filled the full visual field. And in the bubble was my grandmother Roach's face, and she had a gentle smile, and she was smiling at me. And then I felt a physical warmth. And that's the only time in a dream up to that point, or even since then, where I've felt a physical warmth during the dream. And then after maybe 20, 30 seconds, then the bubble starts to rise. And as it rises to the ceiling, the physical warmth disappears. So I knew, absolutely that my grandmother was sending an affirmation. She had bipolar issues and was treated with ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. I use natural approaches. I find with high-dose natural lithium, high-dose fish oil, that if patients are compliant, they rarely need to be on medications or ECT treatments.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned some of these precognitive dreams or communication dreams. That one sounds like. How do you differ them experientially from normal dreams?
Well, I think they're always more vivid. Pay attention to the vivid dreams when those occur, and then just watch for the evidence to kind of prove that. I've had so many patients with precognitive dreams who've seen, for example, they would see exactly what the person they're going to marry looks like long before they ever meet them, right? But one of the dreams I had more recently was an airplane with two pilots, and then one of them has a heart attack and dies. And that was a rather vivid dream. And then I read in the newspaper just a couple of weeks later that in fact had happened on a flight from America to South America. And I'd never read that in the paper before, that type of thing. So the fact that I had the dream and it happened just 2 weeks later, to me, was kind of confirmation of that was precognitive.
Now, have you always thought there was an afterlife?
No, they don't teach that in medical school. And just the opposite. I grew up as a Protestant. I knew I was supposed to do good things, and I wanted to believe in God. But in medical school, they kind of teach you anything that you can't touch, see, hear is not real. And so if your patients present with things that don't fit into categories, that means they're a hypochondriac, right? So because you're a genius doctor, you've had all this great education, and so if it doesn't make sense, then it's the patient's fault, the patient's problem with that. So yeah, scientifically, how could you know that God was real? Was where I was when I graduated from medical school. So obviously, it was a complete shift, when I started hearing the spiritual near-death experiences with that. But I also have to give credit to Dr. Robert Anderson, American Board of Integrative Holistic Medicine. In 2005, I went to their conference, and he shared some fascinating paranormal stories. He is a great physician from the Seattle area and wrote some really good books. So and then at that conference also, they talked about energy medicine a good bit. So that was my introduction to the possibilities. But then my patients are the ones that really confirmed and nailed it with me.
And you've already shared. Are there any compelling stories from your patients that they've shared that you haven't shared with us yet?
Well, I could probably share another 1,000 stories. But,
okay, let's go with one more.
Okay. Well, let me think of...
if you want. No, I mean, I don't.
Yeah,
want to put you in.
I don't have another one that's come right to mind at the moment.
Okay,
But
we can
I've had
this.
patients, premonitions, intuitions, out-of-body experiences, voices, visions, dreams with meaning, seeing and sensing spirits. Now, an important point to make, I think, is I've identified largely when I meet a patient, I can tell generally whether they've had spiritual near-death experiences. For one thing, they tend to have somewhat of a glow about them. They have a gentle smile. But there are certain characteristics, and I gave a lecture at IANS a year ago on the God gene. So individuals that are intuitive and have a knowing of a higher divinity are individuals with a good on switch and not a good off switch. So they're more prone to being anxious, panicky, obsessive. They're detail oriented, cross the T's, dot the I's, very thorough workaholics. Always have more projects. They can't sleep unless they've exercised until exhaustion. Phobias, sleep disturbance, irritability, carbohydrate craving, swelling, breast sores, stiffness, migraines, every periods, cramping, bloating, brain fog, aches and pains in joints and muscles, and gallbladder disease. So this is all associated. If you have those characteristics, if I meet someone who's anxious, then I know that they likely have nearly all those other traits associated with that. If I meet someone who's had gallbladder disease, I know that they likely have had all those other traits. And it's tied in with sensitivities to food, sensitivities to odors like perfume and cologne, sensitivities to light, to noise, to electromagnetic fields, to mold. And these are very caring individuals. They give and give and give. They don't feel appreciated, have inner resentment. They're empaths, meaning they get around negative energy. They absorb that. They don't do well. You walk in a certain shop, and they say, "Woo, I've got to get out," right? These are individuals that have been in fight or flight every single day their whole life. And a key detox pathway doesn't work where they're not getting rid of not only toxins, but also estrogen metabolites. So they're high risk for chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia because of that. But because they don't get rid of estrogen metabolites, they have more female issues if they're female. And then estrogen promotes autoimmune activity. So if a patient has allergies, if they have thyroiditis, then I know 25 or 30 more things about them, right? All autoimmune patients have those characteristics associated with them. So I explained to these patients, listen, it's a package deal. You're intuitive, you have a knowing of a higher power, and you may have had knowing from day one, the day you were born, but it comes with this baggage of being in fight or flight every day, your whole life. And because their adrenaline kicks in and they can't metabolize it due to a COMT gene mutation, then PTSD is a major thing. So I teach them at that first visit, in the religion I'm part of, forgiveness isn't an option. In order to be forgiven, we have to forgive. And again, not at a level of you're a jerk, but I forgive you, but a level of grace. And patients start crying when I do that. They'll tear up. And they ask me, am I psychic? How do you know all these things about me? But it's experience where I've put those pieces together.
How do you know them? Do they come to you in words, visions, and inner knowing? I mean, because it does sound like a type of psychic downloading.
I
How
think,
you tell me how it is for you.
yeah, I do. I am able to sense. I can look at someone and largely sense, where they are in life and what their background probably has been. And I was told, by my higher self that actually it was that I had that gift of being able to read people very readily, and so I am trusting that more and more as time goes by, and and since that reading 3 months ago from my higher self, I've incorporated a lot more spirituality with that, right? I talk to patients, before you get out of bed in the morning, after you go to bed at night, tell the universe, tell the creator your intentions. What is it you want? And then make an angry list, everyone you've been angry with your whole life, and send out love every day to those individuals. 2 or 3 people you need to forgive, and maybe ask for forgiveness from. And then if you have a negative thought, cancel, and switch into gratitude. 3 things that you're grateful for every morning, 3 different things every evening. But again, if you have a negative thought, go into gratitude. We have electrical lighting, we have indoor plumbing, we have climate control. 150 years ago, we didn't have any of that. That's all new. So we could very readily go around 24/7 in a state of awe. And if we do, we're sending out positive energy to others. We're sending out positive energy to our bodies. Our bodies are going to be much healthier. We're going to protect ourselves from disease and disorders. And we're going to help make the universe a better place because that ripples out into the universe.
Now, just one question about the forgiving. It doesn't mean you restart relationships with
No,
people
yeah,
who are detrimental to you.
yes, no, you've always have to practice discernment with regards to that. So, yeah, you can forgive them in your mind, but do not re-enter a scenario. In fact, I counsel my patients, try to get rid of negative energy, in your home environment, in your work environment, in your social environments. Get away from that. And, some people may need counseling. I don't always trust counseling with that situation, but you absolutely have to use discernment. And one story that a patient shared, she was in an abusive marriage and she wouldn't get out because she'd made a promise to God with her marriage vows that she would stay true to her marriage. But she had, basically the creator spoke to her and said, listen, you may have made that vow, but that other person, your husband, did not make that vow, right? He didn't agree to that in the marriage vows. I mean, he may have said that, but he didn't. He wasn't intending to follow through on that. So the creator said, you're free as a bird. You get out of that situation as fast as you can. And absolutely, if you're around negative energy, you need to go to work and make plans for getting away from that. And you can't grow. You can't cultivate yourself into to your spiritual being. Get on your spiritual pathway. You want to get on that pathway, stay on that pathway as quickly as you can and as long as you can.
Right. Yeah. And I guess, yeah, I mean, I know it's become a very big deal to me since studying all this to be very careful about who I spend my time with. I'm still very
Well,
social, But I
Well,
used to
because
not be so careful.
right, because I know 25, 30 more things about you, right? And you're an empath. And so you get around negative energy, you do not do well around negative energy at all. You got to steer clear of it. So you're not someone who probably should, help with the criminal element or those, maybe focus on the people in the Beatitudes of the Bible, that are weak and poor and disheveled. Those types of individuals are ones that you can really help. But don't try to convince negative energy that they're wrong about anything. Just get far away from them as soon as you can.
Right. I feel I can have a light conversation or do some work to fight for social justice, but who I want in my inner circle, yeah, I've really learned. I used to have a lot of negative people around me, and you're
Yeah,
right,
right.
it was very detrimental. I think some people can put
Yeah.
more of a barrier up than I have been able to. So,
And combined with you giving and not being appreciated, right? And you overgive in those situations, and people learn to take advantage of you, and they will lean on you inappropriately. So you're the goose that lays the golden eggs. You got to take care of yourself so you can then be there to help others.
right. Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, I would tell everyone to surround yourself with people that inspire you, feel healthy, don't weigh you down. I mean, I think that's something obviously all of us should. And if you are the negative person, then, I don't know, I'll say you're not necessarily a bad person. Maybe you need to heal some things in yourself. I mean, maybe you are a terrible person. There's some terrible people out there. I've mentioned on this podcast some of the ones I don't like, of the known ones, but
And
yeah, they're
part of us entering a new era is, psychedelics are becoming mainstream. And, when these negative energy individuals experience the other side and realize the reality of that through a psychedelic experience, then they're transformed by that. Yeah, it's not legal in most places, but, there's ketamine that's legal anywhere. But, places like Colorado and Oregon, it's been decriminalized. So increasingly, those experiences are going to be available, and it's probably something that virtually every one of us, once we achieve full maturity, need to experience to have a sense of the reality of the universe, of the divinity with that. And I think those experiences, not everyone recognizes it when they have those experiences, but that's what's happening. And if you can grasp that, it's transformational.
okay. And is there a way to have those kinds of experiences without doing psychedelics, to have them naturally? Because
Well,
I'm a little scared of psychedelics. Like, I'm not against them. I really believe everyone do what you want with your own body, whatever that is. But I feel really afraid of psychedelics, but I want those
but it,
experiences, because who doesn't?
well, with psychedelics, there are different versions. Psilocybin, when done with a chaperone in a safe environment, 0% side effects. It's been studied by Roland Griffiths, at Johns Hopkins, and he's looked at it extensively. And psilocybin, very, very safe. However, other psychedelics, you have to be more cautious with that. But yeah, there are other ways, and that's meditation. And I've finally gotten to the point where I've built up to nearly an hour of meditation every night, and I feel it's my favorite time of day because I just let loose of all the burdens and just relax and open up and listen for messages. At that point, if you think of prayers as sending messages, think of meditation as being open to receiving messages from the universe and the creator with that. And so if you meditate over an extended period of time, you can get to that point, but it's just a lot faster with psychedelics to do it that way. Uh, so I'm looking forward to the time when those are, when psilocybin is going to be more readily available.
Yeah. I mean, I do know a lot of people who do it, and I think if you want to do it, go for it. Do it carefully. Research a safe place, go where you feel safe with people you feel safe with. But
Sure.
yeah, I think all of us really know what our bodies need. And,
Yeah.
I mean, it looks like legal wise, that our society's becoming more and more open to it. But I mean, if it's,
I
you
would
could still find
mention
ways.
the trance medium or trance channeler shared with me, wait till the psychedelic calls you. In other words, maybe instead, you never want to do psychedelics from a recreational perspective. You should never go that route. But he suggested wait till the psychedelic calls you, right? It has a consciousness associated with it, and it'll let you know, if the time is right for that experience. So it's probably not something to really just plow in to see. There's a time in your life where that would be appropriate, and I think you'll get that message when that time, if that time occurs.
Yeah. And I have one last question. What makes you most convinced that there is an afterlife?
Well, talking with ETs is pretty convincing, and they report that, and they're a little more advanced than I, and maybe by 1 billion years or more. That's probably the most convincing thing for me. But also, again, the spiritual near-death experiences. There's no question. I was 100.000% convinced after hearing a large number of those. It's absolutely, there's no question about that. And it's just a matter of how far you're willing to research to confirm that for yourself. But the evidence is out there. It's just a matter of you investigating that for yourself to confirm it.
Wonderful. It's been really interesting. Actually, I'm going to ask, are you going to the IANS conference in Arizona again next Labor Day weekend?
I will be there for sure. It was a wonderful experience in DC. So met so many great people.
It was a really special experience. I'm going to try to make it again. And if any listeners, look into it. Come say hi to us. I would love to meet you.
Absolutely. Same here.
And so where can our listeners find you? Tell them the names of your books, where they can follow you, all of that.
Well, my first book that has over 200 stories about spiritual near-death experiences and transformative spiritual events is called God's House Calls, and that's available on Amazon. It was number one in 5 categories when it was released. The second book was Vital Strategies in Cancer. I trained under the top botanical medicine expert who's had great success in dealing with cancer, maybe more successful than anyone else in the country. And so I've studied under him for 17 years, and I'm seeing really good successes with that. My third book is Brilliance, and basically the pursuit of hope, wisdom, and the divine. So it's kind of optimal mood, optimal brain, and then optimal divinity. And there is more stories like I've been sharing today in that book. So it's a very entertaining book, and it was recommended. My cancer book was recommended by Mark Hyman, and this book was recommended by Scott Shannon, the top integrative psychiatric specialist in the country, and by Dwight McKee, the top integrative oncologist for decades. So I've gotten wonderful reviews with these books. I have a newsletter that I'd strongly recommend that you're signing up for. My website, drroach.net, drroach.net, talks about my conference every year and has sign up for the newsletter. And then themidwaycenter.com is the other website for my office. And I see a sprinkling of patients from around the eastern half of the country for cancer issues, particularly. But really, I treat anything that other doctors can't fix. I love autistic children, for example, because there's so much you can do with those kids when the resources are available.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Liz. And we'll see you in Arizona.
Yes, you will. Okay, I'm kidding.
To get more information on what the fuck just happened, go to WTFJustHappened.net. There, you can order my book, WTF Just Happened, A Sciencey Skeptic Explores Grief, Healing, and Evidence of an Afterlife. You can learn all about how I came to conclude that there most likely is an afterlife, but you can also learn about the early stages of my grief and the amazing fascinating people I met along the way. You can read about how much I harassed the mediums and scientists trying to get evidence to see if the mediums were cheating and see if what everyone was saying actually was true. You can also subscribe to our newsletter to stay updated on any new developments and any interesting new what the fuck updates. So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. It makes such a difference, especially for a new podcast like this one. And if any of you have had a crazy what the fuck yourself, have any questions, feedback, or just want to say hey, reach out on either Instagram at WTF_just_happened_, or email me at hello@WTFjusthappened.net. I love hearing from all of you. It makes my day hearing your stories and questions and feedback and all of it. And remember, you don't have to draw any final conclusions as you wonder, what the fuck just happened?